Okay. Good morning, guys. This episode is going to be about phenomenology of grief and death. This is perhaps a very bold, bold move, bold video for me. Um, Considering I've had a recent death in the family, but for me, I can't let these reflections go unsaid. And sometimes sometimes the when we make reflections and when we record them, sometimes it's for us to not merely inform people but to say them out loud, to say them out loud. um, but anyways, I want to begin with I want to start this off actually with a poem by Rilke in his Duino Elegies. And so I'm going to read just a small portion of the first elegy, and then I'm going to go into my reflections about this phenomenology of death and grief. So let me pull this up. If I cried out, who would hear me up there among the angelic orders? And suppose one suddenly took me to his heart, I would shrivel, I couldn't survive next to his greater existence. Beauty is only the first touch of terror. We can still bear, and it awes us so much because it so coolly disdains to destroy us. Every single angel is terrible, and since that's the case, I choke back my own dark bird call, my sobbing. Oh, who can we turn in this need? Not angels. Okay, so why? I've been. So why this poem? Well, I've been trying to discover those exact reasons. Why am I so haunted by those words that Rilke says in the Duino Elegies? Um, and with the death of my grandfather, I've been for me it's not enough just to simply um, it's not that I want to say this clearly. There is something so profound in your very intimate moments of grieving that we have to pay attention to. And I tasted this. I tasted this, and I did not let this opportunity go by me. Because I feel like most people don't get a chance to really pay attention to this. They get too swayed by what's happening. And I did get swayed by what's happening, but it's crucial that we reflect on what is happening. We take that moment to withdraw and look outside what is happening. So the reason why I read that poem, when Rilke admits in the first section of that elegy, where who do I call, who do I turn to in this moment, and for me, I felt the despair, I felt the very grief in that. And this is when I started to realize something very important, that grieving allows and this can apply for anything: pain, suffering, agony, sadness, loneliness. It all allows an opportunity, allows you it first of all, let's look at how it happens, right? When you're sad and you're grieving, you withdraw. You withdraw so deep into yourself, so deep, you know. And I was thinking about the moment. I was thinking about the moment I was crying, and it's something so intimate, right? It's something that it truly like seeps inside of you, right? It really, you are truly withdrawing into yourself and past yourself, right? And when the whole body grieves and withdraws into itself, right? It is shaking, right? It's shaking, it's trembling. And I thought more about this. For me, even though there's no actual physical, visual perception, but I can only give a metaphor to understand what is happening, is that when we withdraw into this grief, into this deep, intimate grief, you are breaking past into another world, into your inner world, right? Um, and I, and the best way that I can explain this is think about traveling at the speed of light and how fast and you would whole body would reverberate and vibrate and everything would shake. You're breaking past barriers, right? You're shooting past all these speed barriers. Um, Grief, when you are withdrawing into yourself, grief is like that. Like when you're truly experiencing that grief, um, you're withdrawing. And I was thinking more about this as well, about, you know, it's just very interesting how the body responds like that. Because even if I were to give a more not traumatic example, but let's say if I were to just like touch something that hurts me, right? If there's a hot stove and I kind of go by it and I go, ooh, yeah, don't touch that, right? Well, it's interesting that the body withdraws, right? You withdraw. Every time you feel loneliness, things withdraw, right? Things get pulled in. And really, I know like this isn't even profound for people to say this, but I talk about the phenomenology of grief because it gives you an opportunity. This withdrawal, this withdrawal into yourself, gives you an opportunity, a presence, to encounter a presence, basically. And I can't explain to you. I honestly, I can't explain to you. I wish I could explain to you, but only in poetry can you have a hint of this. Um, you know, only in poetry you can have a hint of this. And you know, I've just been thinking about it because poetry. You know, poetry is one of those things that the more I understand the purpose of it, and I think it was my talk with Samuel Barnes that kind of haunted me when he said, what's the difference between um, fiction and novels and poetry? What's the difference? And I couldn't answer it at the time, but for me now I can answer is that poetry allows a more intimate perception, a more intimate perception, how things are rising. right? In a novel, you're in a narrative, right? You get immersed in a narrative. But in poetry, well, they're teaching you how to see. Uh, they're teaching you how to taste. And so this phenomenology of grief is that what I'm trying to say is that I'm trying to teach how to taste grief. And that tasting this grief begins with its withdrawal into itself, right? Your withdrawal into yourself. And with poetry, I found this. I started, I didn't understand why I was reading. I kept reading the Duino elegies almost every day. And I just read elegy after elegy, and I didn't understand why I was doing it. Until finally today it hit me. I was like, wow. So this is what's been going on, right? That the whole point is to experience this withdrawal, be intimate with this withdrawal into itself, and shoot past that barrier, meet the presence that is inside. And I can only ever be ambiguous because I can't explain it to you. And this is where we start seeing the tangibility or the communication between poetry and philosophy for myself, where poetry for me is a tasting, and then philosophy teaches me how to explain, if I dare to explain. Right? It teaches me to try to explain in some fashion. I'll give one more example of something from Gibran concerning death. And was it in the Prophet? It says here, then Al-Mitra spoke, saying, we would ask now of death. And he said, you would know the secret of death, but how shall you find it unless you seek it in the heart of life? The owl whose night-bound eyes are blind unto the day cannot unveil the mystery of life. If you would indeed behold the spirit of death, open your heart wide unto the body of life. For life and death are one, even as the river and the sea are one. So that this now precludes to us precludes. This now leads us to talk about death. In my moments of grieving and also attending the funeral, I noticed something very interesting, actually. And I started thinking about this a little bit more, and how things. I was just noticing how it moves. That's all I was paying attention to. And oftentimes when something dies, it's really interesting in a way that, like, you're attracted to it. That's the thing that's crazy about it, is that you're attracted to it. When you see something dead on the road, you almost like you're like pulled by it. You want to look at it. You want to get closer to it. You want to examine it. And even life, even things that die around us. And the first thing I think about is like vultures, right? When there's a dead carcass on the road, vultures are circling around it. And yet it's funny. It's really funny in terms of like a very paradoxical way, where all of a sudden this dead thing becomes the very source of life, right? Becomes the very attraction of life. The vultures circling, the bugs consuming the dead carcass, the other animals waiting and lurk for approaching this death, right? Their hunger. And it's really interesting because it's like death is a type of nourishment, isn't it? And death is something that nourishes us. And death is something that gives us life. And see, it was in those very moments that I was at the funeral that I began to see this, that I began to really notice this and pay attention to it, about death, about how it arises. And I thought more and more after the funeral, I thought more and more about death, more and more about grief, um, and how honestly death attracts life. And the funeral's the best example that you can give about how all of a sudden everybody's pulled to the body, pulled to the dead. And yet grief itself is interesting too, right? Like I had already previously said, that grief is this withdrawal. And because grief always withdraws into itself, you're always alone in your grief. And the only reason why we can relate is because we have experienced withdrawal. But overall, it is always your grief and your grief alone. You know, and that's why I read the passages from Rilke, and then I read that passage from The Prophet by Gibran, because this is what poetry teaches me. It's hard to explain it because when you read it, you're like, I don't really get it, right? But it wasn't until my grandfather died that I actually tasted it, you could say. I really tasted it and I understood it. And now when I read Rilke's Duino elegies, it's even more powerful because it's like I understand what he's talking about. Rilke, not only is he talking about human beings, but he's talking about the human condition, the suffering human condition, and how even if you were to call to the angels, and even if they were to come, let's just entertain the idea, they would destroy you by their own presence, their own beauty, their own so on. So that who do you call, right? This is the significance of the first elegy. Rilke says, who do I call, knowing this? Knowing that even the beauty of the angels would destroy me on the spot. And that it shows how lonely you are in this process. But again, and I guess this is the part where it's starting to get very unsayable for me. So I'm gonna have to probably cut this video short, because I really feel like I'm hitting the language, the edges of language here. But I will leave it like this. I will leave us with this. When you experience grief, when you are in the throes of death, an image awakens. And not only do you have to spend time with that image, which is your grieving, but also you need to have a dialogue with that grieving. You need to have a dialogue with the image. It's not enough just to grieve. You have to have a dialogue with the image that is the cause of your grieving. And this is how I came to understand with, kind of like advancing my perception about how this is all interacting, the grief, the agony, the pain, people dying, the death of my grandfather, so on. I'm paying attention to this. So again, it's the dialogue with the image of death, the dialogue of the image of grief. That is what is very important to us, that we need to have. And, again, if you don't know what that means, I can't help you. I really can't help you. It's, you know, that I think that's the part that's really painful for me. It's like I can't, you know, allude to much more than that. But okay, uh, that's really the end of the video there. So, all right, I hope you guys take care. Okay, all right, bye.